Hi there, this is Lauren Kimball for ANI 150, and this tutorial is going to review modeling the can for exercise 1. Now since we already went over this in class, this tutorial is going to be a little bit faster than my typical tutorials. We're going to kind of buzz through this a little quicker, but it should be a good review if you missed anything. Alright, first step, we're always going to set our projects. If you don't have a project folder, you need to go over here and create one using the project window. So File, Project Window. I already created this folder, so I'm going to go to Set Project, and I'm going to look for it. There it is, Exercise 1 Food Can. It is on my desktop and set. Remember, if you are working from a school computer, set your directory to the desktop so that it's easy to find. Don't care where you put it if you're at home, wherever it's easiest for you to find and store, but if you're working on a school computer, the computers get wiped every night. Put it somewhere you can find. If you forget to set your project folder, it is going to go to the default project folder that exists somewhere in like the project, Maya, Autodesk. You have to go hunt it down. So let's avoid all that drama and just set our projects. All right? So next step is I want to go ahead and bring in an image plane. Image planes are super helpful for creating a model. What they are essentially is an image attached to a camera. Now we don't want to just attach to any old camera. We want to attach it to a camera that doesn't move. Our perspective view, where we're going to be toggling around, having the image bounce around is not going to be helpful. So I'm going to tap spacebar and I'm going to look for a different camera view. Let's go with the front view. I'm going to hover my mouse over the front view and tap again, and here we are in the front view. Whenever you press spacebar, it takes you to this 4-pane view of all the available cameras, and you can always populate it by whatever the mouse is hovering over. You get the idea. So now that I'm in my front view, I want to bring the image plane in. Let's go to View, Image Plane, Import Image. Now, if you open this and you don't see the can reference, download it from Canvas and stick it in the Source Images folder of your Exercise 1. So whatever you named your Exercise 1 project folder, you're putting it in that source image folder. Source images are things that we're bringing in to Maya. So source images are images we bring in. And the images folder is things we're kicking out. Things like renders or UV snapshots, okay? I'm going to click on Can Reference, and I'm going to click Open, and there it is. Perfect. Tap spacebar, and it takes us back to our 4-pane view. Let's go ahead and press spacebar again. We're in the perspective view. Awesome. So there's our image plane, kind of sitting in the middle of our grid. Not ideal. If I'm modeling, I definitely want to not have that sitting in the middle of my mesh. So let's go ahead and move it backward. But before I do, spacebar, because I want you to see this. When I move it back, you might see it move in the perspective view, in the side, and the top view, but it doesn't shrink in the front view. It's really nice that it just stays the same size, so you don't have to worry about scaling or things getting smaller against the horizon line, because that's not how this camera operates. Okay, so last thing I want to do is make it so I don't accidentally select this image plane, because when I click off of it, I could be modeling, extruding faces, and boom, I grabbed the image plane on accident. So what I want you to do is go to your channel box. That's that menu over here with all the numbers. If you don't see this menu, tap Control A, and you'll see that, and you should see it. So generally speaking, you're either going to see your channel box or you're going to see this menu. This is your attribute editor, okay? So attribute editor, hold down Control A, and boom, it takes us back to the channel box. All right, if you still don't see it, then you might want to go back up to your workspace and reset your current workspace, because maybe something's really off. Okay, so now that we're in our channel box, we want to go down a little lower. Beneath the channel box, we have our display layers. Right now there's no display layers, but that's where they're going to populate. There's 2 tabs here, display layers and animation layers. Make sure you have display layers selected. We're going to click on that image plane, and we're going to click on the last box over here to the far right. This box, this last button, will allow you to create a layer and populate it with whatever you have selected. If you forget that, just hover and it'll tell you what each of these buttons do. Like this one here will create a layer but not put anything in it. This one though creates a layer and puts whatever you have selected in it. Alright, so now the image plane is tucked away. Great. but it doesn't solve our problem as far as not selecting it. To make it so that it's visible but not selected, that's the third box. So first box here with the V, visibility. Third box, press it once and you see kind of a wireframe of it. Press it a second time and it says R. That R stands for reference, and it means that you're referencing what's on the layer without touching it. If you want to touch your image plane again, turn that R off and you can grab the asset. But I don't want to, so I'm going to turn it back to R. Alright, at this point it's a good idea to save. Anytime you make a significant change to your scene, save that scene, file, save scene as. Oh, would you look at that? It's already full of all the different steps. That's because I already recorded this tutorial and the audio didn't work. Fun times. But I would save it here under image plane and I'd press save as. Alright, so generally when we're modeling for like a game asset, we would start with a high poly mesh and then retopologize a lower poly mesh. Because this is such a simple asset, and for the sake of time, we're going to work backwards and we're going to begin with the low poly asset. Let's go ahead and go over here to the poly modeling menu and click on cylinder. Alright, now you can see this cool menu over here in the upper left hand corner of my screen. If you don't see that menu, that's one of your heads-up displays for poly count, go ahead and turn it on. So what this menu does, this little spreadsheet, is it's going to tell you how many faces, edges, vertices are in your scene on a specific object or that you have selected. To see it, you're going to go up to display, heads-up display, poly count. So generally you don't see that menu. Display, heads-up display, poly count will reveal it. Right now I only have one mesh in my scene, so this mesh has 60 faces. Cool. If I duplicate it, so there's two meshes, the first column tells me how many of all of these things, vertices, edges, etc., are in my scene. The second column is going to tell me how many faces are on my selection. And the third column, if I had this in like, let's say, face mode, and I highlighted some faces, I have 4 faces selected, I can see 4 faces are selected. Really helpful. I know it doesn't feel very helpful at the moment, but it will be for later. Alright, so this poly cylinder is preset to 20, and that means we have a total of 60 faces. Now that's important to remember because depending on who your art director is, you're going to be given a certain number of, like in a professional setting, whoever your team lead is, they're going to give you a polygon budget to work with, meaning that whatever your low poly mesh is, it cannot exceed that allowance. I think for this assignment, we went with a polygon count of, say, 50 faces were what we were aiming for, so this default cylinder is too many faces by 10. Let's go into inputs and reduce this down a little bit. Let's change its subdivisions to 16. Alright, so now it's 16, and look at that, faces 48, that's well under 50. So now our new low poly can meets the criteria for the number of faces that the low poly is allowed to have. So a low poly is a representation of the mesh at its bare minimum. The high poly is where you get to have fun and make it really look like a can. During this workflow process, what we're ultimately going to do is take all the details on the high poly can and fake them onto the low poly can. That way we get all the prettiness of the high poly mesh, but it doesn't bog down the gameplay. Okay? Alright, so next step, to make this low poly match the proportions of the food can, let's go ahead and tap spacebar and go to the front view. I'm now going to go up to shading, and I'm going to activate X-ray. So what does that do? If I were to just go in and start scaling this can up, notice that the cylinder is eclipsing the image. If I click on shading X-ray, it kind of drops down the opacity of my mesh so I can see through it. Now, whenever you are modeling, make sure that you're kind of jumping back and forth to different viewports. Right now I'm set to 4. If I go over here in my toolbar, I can actually change the panel layout to 2, just so I have more space. If I were to grab the scale on just the sides, on the front view, that looks pretty good. It looks like it matches. But if I go over here, you can see that my can is now kind of oval shaped. This is why we pay very close attention when we're working in a specific viewport that we are keeping an eye on all three of our dimensions. So I'm going to undo and I'm going to scale this down so that the sides of my cylinder match my can. Perfect. And it looks like it maintained its perspective here. All right, now I'm going to scale it up. And I'm going to scale it up until I see the cylinder matching the bottom of my can lip. Good. The top, I'm going to right click and grab the vertices because that's, going to be easier to manipulate. And I'm just going to bring this down so that it matches the top of the lip. Now this can reference is at an angle so we can see part of the top. So you don't have to make it all the way up here. Instead, look for where the can actually is going to end, which is right there. So there's the top of the can, there's the bottom of the can, and we're done. That is our low poly can. Now that we're done modeling our low poly can, let's name it. In the outliner, if you don't see the outliner, it's this button right here above the magnifying glass. We're going to double click it and we're going to name it can_low. For this assignment, it might seem redundant to organize when we only have like maybe 2 or 3 assets. The more you model, the more you build things, the more complicated your scenes become. Get into the habit of naming everything, keeping things tidy, deleting empty groups. What I'm saying probably doesn't make a lot of sense right now, but it will later. Get into the habit of keeping this outliner tidy. All right, so I went ahead and named it. Great. Next, I want to go ahead and zero out my channel box. If we look over here in the channel box, there's a bunch of scale numbers, and that's going to mess with our UVs later on. So to fix that, go to your poly modeling menu and look right here. See these 3 buttons? That is your center pivot, your delete history, and your freeze transformations. The freeze transformation button is the one we want, the one that's got all the zeros. Click it and you'll see that everything is zeroed out back to its defaults. Now below that, this is the history of your mesh. Every time you change something, whether you're tweaking some vertices or you're transforming the geometry, it's going to be recorded here. In order to keep our scenes streamlined, it's good to periodically delete our history as we complete certain steps. So to delete the history, that's the button next to the snowflake. Boom, when I click that, all that history goes away. Great. Center pivot, don't really have to push that. But if, like, for say my pivot point on my can was somewhere off to the side, like that, I could press center pivot to bring it back. Okay? I don't want to do that. I'm going to press undo because I like it being centered up there, right where it was. Okay, so we're done here. I'm going to go over to my display layers and I'm going to go ahead and tuck this in its own layer. So we're going to name this layer, and I'll just call it low poly can. And let's go ahead and name the layer with our image plane in it, image plane, so we know what's what. All right, we're done. We can go ahead and save this step. I, of course, already saved this step at some point, but let's just play pretend. All right, so next thing we need to do is start building up the high poly. Again, this is a little bit reverse order from the usual, but yeah, let's go ahead and build the high poly based on the low poly stand-in. I'm going to grab this can and I'm going to use it to guide the proportions of my high poly can by duplicating it. So my high poly is just going to be a duplicate of this to start with. So press Control D, and now we have 2 cans. That sounded like a bird. 2 cans. Huh. All right, I'm going to click on can low 1, which is the duplicate in the outliner, and I'm going to name it can_high. And then I'll turn off my low poly can. But oh no, when I do that, both my cans disappear. That's no good. Let's turn that layer back on. I want my high poly can to be removed from the display layer. All you have to do is click on that high poly can, click on the layer that it's in, right click and say remove selected object. Remove selected objects. Remember, you can always add them back the same way if you wanted to. You can always right click, add and remove objects. So I'm going to turn off the low poly, click my high poly stand-in, and I'm going to bring it back by typing in 0 so it goes back to the middle. It is so important that you keep all the iterations of this mesh in the same space, in the same 0 space, so that they're overlapping. The process for taking all the details from the high poly mesh and forcing them onto the low poly mesh, that cool magic trick that makes a low poly mesh look like it's high resolution, is dependent on the meshes sharing the perfect space together. Meaning that if my low poly mesh, for instance, was slightly off, like that, you can kind of see it, that would mess up the process, the mesh map baking, that'll ultimately make this illusion work. So be very careful not to push those off to the side, to keep them in that zero space. All right. So there's a lot of ways I could go about this. I could use like symmetry tools up here to model two sides of the can at the same time. A little bit of a pain in the neck. I think the best way when you're approaching something that is symmetrical, meaning like whatever is on one side of the mesh is going to appear on the other side. Let's just cut this in half, model one side, and then mirror it once we're done. That's the technique. That is the way we're going to go. So first I need to cut this thing in half. So the tool I'm going to use, I'm going to hold down Shift and I'm going to go right click. This is a shortcut menu that shows you all the tools you can use on the thing you have selected in the mode you have selected. If I have this in object mode or component mode and I have some faces selected and I go Shift right click, my options change. Now all these options affect the faces. If I go to select and I'm back in object mode, Shift right click, and look at that, different options. So it's kind of a cool shortcut menu. I'm going to go to the Insert Edge Loop tool. The Insert Edge Loop tool is going to add an edge loop based on whether or not you are selecting a horizontal or vertical edge. These are vertical edges going straight up and down. If I click on one, it creates a horizontal edge that cuts through them. If I click up here on one of these horizontal edges, it creates a vertical edge. Notice that this edge does not cut through like it does on the side. Edge loops only work really well with quads. So up here, these are triangles, and that's where the buck stops. You're not going to be able to see the edge loop tool work as well against a triangle. It's meant to work with quads. So just keep that in mind. All right, I'm going to press undo. I want to cut this in half, but the problem with the edge loop tool is that I'm not able to find the center. I'd have to eyeball it, and I don't want to do that. So let's go into the properties of the Insert Edge Loop tool. We're going to double click it, and inside, did I grab the right tool? Hold on a second. Let me function F8, double click. There, yeah, I was in the right tool. I'm sorry. Tired, I've already recorded this tutorial once, and it just didn't work. So let's do that. Let's just wrap this up. Okay, so we're in the tool settings. And we're going to go to multiple edge loops, and it activates something called the equal multiplier, and right now it's set to 2 by default. When I click on one of these edges, look what happens. Oh, it creates 2 edge loops that are equal distance from the top and bottom edge. Cool. That's neat. Not what I want though. So I'm going to press Control Z, and I'm going to drop this number to 1, and then click. And voila, we have officially cut this cylinder in half. Now before I get out of the tool settings, I want to reset the tool so that the Insert Edge Loop tool behaves the way I typically want it to. Close out of that. And let's get rid of everything that's below that edge loop we created. Press Q, that deactivates the edge loop tool that we were using. So if I tried to grab those faces with the edge loop tool turned on, it would just start creating edge loops willy-nilly. So make sure you press Q. Q is our select tool. We're going to right click, go to faces, grab these faces, and delete. When you turn this over, you should see the back faces, which are black. Back faces have no lighting information on them. So that means that it's hollow. That's what we want. Now, if you have something like this occurring, let me F8. If you have something like this occurring where when you cut it for some reason you have this big face, just go to faces and click that face and delete it. We want it to be hollow on the bottom. Alright, so now that we are done with that, I'm going to go back to my front view, and I'm going to use this front view can along with the Insert Edge Loop tool. So if you look here at the bottom of the left side of your screen on the toolbar, this used to be an empty space. But as we create tools or use tools, the last tool we used is always going to be right here. So we don't have to shift right click, we can just click that to activate the last tool. We can also repeat a step or an action in Maya by using the hotkey G. Just fun facts. I'm going to go ahead and click on this and insert an edge loop and stop it right there where the lip of my can is. Okay? Great. Press Q, because again, we don't want to create edge loops willy-nilly. Spacebar, and back to perspective view. There we go. We've now kind of marked where the lip of our can is going to be. Our next step is to go to our face mode, and we're going to select those faces and we're going to extrude them out so that it actually looks like a lip. Because right now, if we were to just turn things off, like select off, you can't really tell anything's changed. We've marked where the lip's going to be. Now we got to model that lip. So I'm going to right click, go to faces, and I'm going to click on a face, hold down shift, and double click again. Oops, that didn't work. Click, hold down shift, double click. There we go. It's going to select all the faces along that edge flow. Now this only works with quads. If I were to go over here and try to double click the triangles, it doesn't work out. If you want to grab all these triangles, just hold down tab and you'll be able to paint your selection. Okay? Alright. Right now we want to grab these. So I'm going to hold down shift, double click, and grab all those edges. Then I'm going to grab my scale tool. Now right now my scale tool is just going to do that. So press undo. If I hold down shift, a word appears. And that's extrude. Oops. Extrude. So if I hold down shift and extrude, and you can let go of shift after you're done, looky there. We're able to pop that geometry out. And there's the lip of our can. Now that lip on the low poly looks really good, but we're not going to leave this way. Ultimately, we're going to make this a really high resolution mesh by smoothing it. Smoothing it is where you add a whole bunch of geometry to just really perfect the resolution of whatever it is you're working on. So if you think about it like Photoshop, smoothing is like adding a higher resolution to your image. Instead of like 72 pixels per inch, you have like 300 and everything is so much nicer. So to actually smooth the mesh, we would have to go to shift, right click, and smooth. And look at that. That's very smooth for sure, but it also kind of messes with the lip that we want. I'm going to press undo. Now, what's really cool about Maya is it has an option called smooth preview. You don't have to keep going in and smoothing the mesh in order to get that effect. Instead, press 3. And as you can see, we now have the illusion of that smoothing, but nothing is actually changed. So just keep that in mind. 1 and 3, those are your hotkeys. 1 is going to show you the model for how it is. 3 is going to show you the smooth preview. Okay, so ultimately we want this mesh to look like the can in the smooth preview view. That is the end goal. So our first obstacle is getting the lip of this can to have a stronger crease. To do that, got to use the edge loop tool. I'm going to go shift, right click, insert edge loop. I'm going to click on one of these vertical edges and I'm going to bring my new edge loop as close to that lip as, well, not as possible, but pretty close. What that does, by adding an edge to the crease, we are reinforcing that crease. The more edges, the more angular things are going to be. Let me show you. I'm going to press 3 for smooth preview and boom, we got a much sharper edge. All right, let's go ahead and reinforce those edges a little bit more. Just get in there and let's like reinforce on the other side. And let's do that over here as well. We're going to just add an edge loop on either side of this corner to make that corner sharper. Okay, and then press Q because we don't want to keep adding edge loops. And then 3 and select and, ooh, maybe that's a little too sharp. What to do if your edge loops are too close to the edge and we want to push them back? We're going to shift right click in edge mode and you're going to see a tool called slide edge tool. Now to slide the edge, we want to double click that edge. When you double click it, if I zoom out, you can see 4, showing the wireframe view, you can see that we have the edge selected all the way around. All right, press 5. This is the edge we want to move. We have our slide edge tool on. All you have to do to make this work is to middle mouse click your selection, and then you can go left to right to move it closer or further away. So I'm going to move it a little further away, double click the next edge, and do the same thing. It's still reinforced, but the edges aren't as close this time to the corner. And the result, go to F8, is going to, sorry, I gotta press function F8 because I'm on a laptop. There we go. Now that edge feels a little bit softer, a little more like that food can. Cool. All right, let's go to the top. We already got an edge loop by default right here, so I think that's going to be fairly nicely enforced. So let's just shift right click and add an edge loop on the other side. There we go. Oops, I forgot to turn off my edge loop tool. Yeah, I like how that looks. I think that looks nice. All right, next up, this is where I would probably save. So File, Save Scene As, and look, I can lip. Let's go ahead and do the top of the can. Now you could just use this as your reference, or you could grab a can from your pantry, or there is another image of the top of the can on the Dropbox on Canvas if you want to look at that for a reference. But we're going to go ahead and make the top of the can match the image better. So first thing I want to do is grab all these triangles, right click, grab faces. Remember, we can't just grab the geometry the same way as the quads. It's a triangle, so we have to hold down tap, and just highlight. Again, tab, not tap. Tongue twisted today. All right, I'm going to grab my move tool, hold down shift, and push this down. That looks about right. Let's go ahead and press Q to get away from that. Press F8 to get into object mode, and press 3. It's deeper, but it's very kind of dipping down in a sort of ramp. We don't like that. We want it to be sharper, so that means we got to reinforce those edges so they're not like sloping. All right, let's press 1, and let's go in and reinforce these edges with the new tool we have, the new skill we have of reinforcing these edges. Insert edge loop tool. Let's add an edge loop to either side of this so that we're reinforcing each corner, this corner, and down here. All right, let's see how that looks. Function F8, 3. Oh, that looks nice. That looks like a can lip, all right. Cool. Now let's get these neat bevels going. I'm going to go to face mode again, hold down tab, and select these triangles. Let's grab scale. Let's hold down shift for extrude and grab the middle and bring this in. Remember, you can let go of shift as soon as you're done. Cool. I'm going to do that again. I'm going to hold down shift and click again. Let go. Use my move tool to move this up a little. And try to use your move tool on just the y-axis. You don't want to accidentally offset this can lid. Okay? Alright, so now that I got it up, I'm going to hold down shift again on scale and bring it in. Use my move tool and push this down. So it's kind of giving us those neat little ridges. Alright, hold down shift to extrude again. Alright, and shift to extrude again. Let go. Move this up. Again, make sure you're on the y-axis. You don't want to accidentally push this off to one side or the other. Scale, shift, bring it in. Shift, bring it down. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. Let's press Control Z. I don't want to extrude, I just want to pop it down. There we go. Select 3. It's getting there. It's a start. I want to reinforce some of these edges so I got better creases toward the bottom. I'm going to add an edge loop over here and over here. Put one over here. Alright, let's go to function F8 because I'm on a laptop, so I got to use the function control. Oh yeah, that looks so much better. It looks very similar, I think. I don't know, I can't quite see it at this angle, but it looks close enough. All right, so however your top of your can looks, you can go ahead and imitate it just by utilizing extrude, scale, and translate. All right? So this at this point I would save this, file, save as, maybe call this can lid. And then I would move on to the mirroring of the geometry. Mirroring. All right, I'm going to click on the mesh. Let's go ahead and tidy up. Let's delete the history. And then to mirror, we're going to shift right click and we're going to look for the mirror option. But don't just click mirror. Instead, click the box next to mirror. All right, I'm going to reset these settings and walk you through them. First, we don't want it to cut the geometry. We do want it to copy. We do not want it to mirror on the world axes though. The world axes means that it's going to mirror directly on this, like on this grid. So it would mirror right where the mesh meets the grid instead of down below it. So instead, let's ask it to do the object. Mirror against the object's edge. And we're wanting to mirror downward, that's the y-axis. And then I think we can leave everything else alone. Mirror, and voila. Let's look at it from the side view. I don't think it did like I asked it to. Something is off. Something's off because it did not mirror along the object like I hoped. And there is the problem. So you might not have noticed it, but the can was coming up short. And the reason is because of the pivot point. When it is mirroring against the object, it is flipping around that pivot point. So if I go to the front view, you can kind of see it. The pivot point is sitting on the grid, probably because I center pivoted earlier. So let's snap this pivot point back to the bottom. We can do that by tapping D, and then that allows us to move just the pivot point. Using just the y-axis, hold down the V key. That means snap to vertice. And boom, snapping right there. I can tap D again, and as you can see, our pivot point is now at the bottom of this can, which is right where we want it to be. All right, I'm going to shift right click, and I'm going to go back to my settings, copy object, y-axis, combine and merge. Okay, mirror. That looks better. Let's look at this. Oh, look. It is the same height, and dimensions as the low poly. It's going to stop right there at the top of the can, and the bottom of the can it's not too short. Now, I don't need this edge loop anymore, so I don't need that. Press Q. If you want that little box to go away, if you want the box to come back, you can press T, but Q is where I want to be. Don't need this edge loop anymore now that I've mirrored my geometry. And a good lesson in getting rid of edges, do not do this. Do not right click, grab an edge, and just delete it. It may look like you deleted it, but look, see how it's not quite acting right? Go to vertex mode and you'll see the vertices it left behind. You could just go grab those and delete again, but let me show you the proper way to delete an edge when you need to. So I'm going to go select, go to edge mode, double click this edge. When you're ready to delete, shift right click, shift right click, oh, I'm holding down control, shift right click, delete edge. And this time, you'll notice no vertices. Yay! Alright, so this is done. I would go ahead and save this scene as a mirror geometry, or whatever you want to name it. Just put a little note that reminds you what you did. Now this is not strictly speaking at the high poly can now, is it? Because to make it the high poly can, we need to smooth it. But first, delete history, let's put this in its own layer, and let's rename it. I'm going to change this from can high to can medium. Why? Because instead of smoothing this can and making it our high-res version, let's have one more version in between that we can always come back to if we need to. So why would we do this? Well, first, let's go ahead and stick this in its own layer, naming it medium can, medium poly can. Let's go ahead and duplicate it, Control D. take this duplicate, make sure we remove it from the layer, and hide the medium can. So the reason we're keeping a copy of the medium can is the medium can is so much easier to edit than the high poly can is going to be. So let's go ahead and rename this in the outliner as can high. And let's smooth this puppy. So I'm going to shift right click and I'm going to go to smooth and I'm going to click the box next to smooth. That opens up the options for that function. I'm going to reset it so that it's going to look just like yours at home. And I'm going to leave all of this alone except division levels. I'm going to change that to 2 just to kind of add an extra level of smoothness. And I'm going to click smooth. And there is our high poly can. Now obviously if you look at all these polygon faces, if I want to make a change, that's a lot of work. That's why it's nice to have a medium version of the can. And then of course, our low poly version of the can. There's all 3 of them, low, medium, and high. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have here. In the total scene, we have, let's look at the poly count of these. In the total scene, we've got, yeah, it looks like 13,248 faces total. The low poly can is 48 of those faces, the medium is 784, and the high poly is 12,416. So, yeah, you can tell that the game engine would probably have an easier time dealing with just 48 faces than trying to compute 12,416. So, all right, our next step is going to be putting these back where we found them. Just remember, we want to keep 0 space, right? And the next thing that we're going to want to do is start to prepare things for textures. Now, I'm going to turn off the medium and the low poly. I'm going to put the high poly in its own layer because we don't want to mess with it right now. High poly can. And I'm going to reveal my low poly can. I can turn off the image plane too. I just want my can. I want my low poly can. So the next step in this process is we need to UV map the can. Now there's a whole tutorial for how to UV map the can, but I'm going to briefly revisit it. If you want an exhaustive view of what the UV texture editor does, you should watch the tutorial that goes over the basics of UV mapping and then shows you how to UV map both the can and the die. But I'm just going to do this really quick. I'm going to go to UV editor, and that's what this looks like. These are the default UVs for the can, and they're not great. Here, let me just bring this window over and move this can here. They're not great. They're not great because if we look here at the shaded view, well no, the shaded view is not going to show us anything. If we go over here and we look at the squares, squares are showing you exactly how a texture map is going to lay against those UVs. They don't look bad on top because this is what we're looking for. We're looking for perfect squares. But look at the stretching. That's not ideal. So we're going to lay out our own UV maps. All right, so how I would recommend going about this, let's turn off the squares because they're quite distracting, is we're going to project 2 different texture map types. So I'm going to shift right click and grab the sides, go to create, and I'm going to use a cylindrical UV map, which wraps a map bounding box around my can. Let's grab this little red thing here that allows me to scale it down. There we go. And now I have this UV shell. It's not perfect yet, but it's a good start. So I got this UV shell of just the sides. And these don't actually need to be laid out again. We're almost done. We've got the tops that are already looking pretty good, and now we have the side that's laid out better. Let's go ahead and go to shift right click, layout UVs. There we go. We're going to lay out our UVs. Oh, before we do that, I want to grab this shell and I want to unfold it. So when I unfold a UV shell, it's going to lay out the squares in proportion to each other. So if I go over here, you can see that the squares are quite squished. But if I unfold, everything's nice and square. Okay, so first step was to unfold, and the next step after that is to quickly lay them out. I'm going to shift right click, I'm going to go to layout, and I'm going to click on the square. These are my default layout settings. Packing resolution, our textures are going to be 2048. Gonna leave all this alone. Gonna go down here and change this to 2048. I like having a little bit of shell padding, meaning there's about 10 pixels between all my shells. Each of these are a UV shell. Again, this is super brief. You want a more exhaustive view, check out the tutorial that goes over this in detail. Tile padding, 10. That means there'll be 10 pixel space between all these shells and the borders. And I want uniformity, meaning that everything is going to maintain the same texel density. So we talked about texel density a little bit in class, and that just means that these are all scaled in such a way that their squares are the same size. Let me show you. Layout UVs, they're all packed nicely in the UV space. Let's look at the squares. This is when you have uniform texel density. If you have lots of texel density, it means you have a higher resolution on that surface. If you have very little texel density, it means you have like pixelated surface. It's going to be much lower resolution. So if I wanted to, I could give these can lids a higher texel density by scaling them up. So now the squares are smaller on the top than they are on the side. Not ideal. It's a really good idea if you have something that you need to put detail into, like say a human face. But for a general asset, you want to keep the uniformity of the scale on that map. You want to keep the texel density uniformed. Okay? So now my UVs have been set for my can. Oh goodness, look at that. I noticed that this is slightly angled. I'm going to go ahead and straighten that up a little bit. I like that better. Okay. I'm just going to leave it. So what I want to do next is take a UV snapshot of this. I'm going to go ahead and click this button here, this camera. And this is going to send this to my images folder. Image format, we're going to go ahead and choose PNG because that is a lossless format. Lossless meaning that there's not going to be any compression. And then everything else can stay the same, apply and close. Okay, I guess I needed to select all my UV shells before I did that. Let's do that. So I'm going to right click, go to UV shell, select all three of these, and now I'm going to click apply and close. It worked that time. If you see it go red, just select the shells that you want to export on the UV snapshot. And now I'll be able to minimize this, go to my exercise 1, images, and there are my UVs. Let's open this with photos. Showed up on my other screen. There it is, UV snapshot, yay! Step after this, besides saving our scene, you're going to want to take your low poly can. Oops, hold on a second, function F8. Take your low poly can, you're going to go to File, Save Scene As. File, Export Selection. And we're going to want to export this as an FBX. So lately we've been saving everything as a Maya file, and that's like, if we were to compare this to Photoshop, it would be like saving this as a PSD. But PSDs can only be opened in Photoshop or other Adobe software packages. What if I want to open this up anywhere? I'd have to save it as something universal like PNG or JPEG. So FBX is an polygon asset file format that would allow me to open this up in like 3ds Max or Substance Painter. So now that you know why, let's go ahead and call this can_low. Oh, there's the version, and export selection. All right, cool. Let's go ahead and grab the high poly can. Now, some of you might be wondering, wait, don't we have to UV map that high poly can? No, you only have to UV map an asset that's going to be textured. This high poly mesh is never going to be brought into a game. All we're going to do is take all these details and bake them, or fake them for another term, onto the low poly mesh. So only the low poly mesh needs to be UV'd. All right, File, Export Selection, Can High, Export, and you're done. You'll be ready for the next tutorial. Thank you so much for your time and have a wonderful day.